First of all, I would like to wish a very good evening to all my friends in the East and a very good morning to all my friends in the West. The topic of discussion today, as you all know, is there anything scientific about spirituality? Now, before we begin answering this question, we need to understand where is this question coming from? What is the source of this question? What is the origin of this question? So, when we think of science and spirituality, the first thing that comes to mind is that perhaps science is something very modern and spirituality is something very very ancient, and there must be some dichotomy between the two, that something that is so modern and something that is so ancient cannot really have things in common. But is that really true? So the first question that we need to ask is science modern and spirituality really ancient? If we try to analyze history, we'll realize that this is not really true. When man began living in societies, the first thing that were discovered, things like agriculture, things like fire, were also acts of scientific discoveries, were also acts of scientific invention. So science is not something new. The forms of science may have changed, the way we do science may have changed, the tools that we used in science may have changed, but science by itself is not new. And the process of doing science, as you can see in this picture, that this man says, I was just rubbing sticks together for fun. I didn't realize I was doing basic research. Even today, if you take many of the top scientists like Feynman, and people like that, they also do science mainly because it gives them joy, because it gives them fun. And the scientific discoveries that they make is kind of a byproduct of those efforts. And what about spirituality? Spirituality is of course very very ancient. If you take various religions in the world, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they are very very old. But they also had similar beginnings, that when a man or a woman makes a scientific discovery, the joy that the person gets is also kind of a spiritual experience. So science and spirituality are two very very old facets of human civilization, and there need not really be a dichotomy between the two. Now, when we think of science and spirituality, another point that comes to mind is that science is about the outside world and spirituality is about the inside world. So science is about what lies outside of us and spirituality is about what lies inside of us. Now, when we talk of outside and inside, we need to ask, where is the boundary? So what is the boundary that separates this world outside and the world inside? So the boundary, my friends, is our ego, what we call I, me, myself. So whatever we consider a part of ourselves, the part of the definition of I, that analysis of that part belongs to the domain of spirituality. And whatever we consider outside of this I, that is what we study in science. We usually don't carry out scientific experiments on our siblings, on our friends, but we do carry out scientific experiments on things we are not really attached to. So that brings to us to the next very important point, that science is about attaching to things we are detached from. Usually we do not do scientific analysis of things that we are attached to. So science is always about attaching to things we are detached from, and on the contrary, spirituality is about detaching from things we are attached to. So here comes the primary difference between science and spirituality, that science is an act of attachment and spirituality is an act of detachment. And this leads to another controversy, that perhaps science and spirituality are two very very different things and they do not really have anything in common. But we'll try to see that this is not really true, that science and spirituality indeed can have a lot in common and they can learn from each other. So another point that sort of seems to differentiate this world of science and spirituality is this terms called absolute and relative. So when we talk of spirituality, it usually begins with some idea of God or some idea of Brahman. If you take any religion or any spiritual faith in this world, all of them usually talk about some idea of God or Brahman that lies inside of us at the core of our being, and connecting to that source is all that is known as spirituality. And science is about the outside world, and the outside world falls under the domain of Maya, and that world is known to be a relative world. And that is why it is believed that science is about the relative world and spirituality is about the absolute. Now, people who follow Buddhism may not really agree with this, because in Buddhism, there is no concept of Brahman or God, because they talk of Shunyata. But if you actually try to analyze the way those statements about Shunyata are constructed, one will realize that there is not so much of real difference between the concept of Atman and the concept of Shunyata. They are pretty much the same. Just that the way those statements are written are different, but the basic concept remains the same. So now, is this really true? Is science really about the relative and spirituality about the absolute? Of course, it is theoretically true that if you want to construct a theory of spirituality, you will have to talk about some sense of absolute, in some sense. But from the practical point of view, that is not true. Because from the practical point of view, what really matters is what we do in our day to day lives. And from that point of view, science is about objective laws, laws that are the same no matter where you are and no matter what time you talk about those laws. But spirituality, on the other hand, is about subjective relationships. So when I talk about a scientific law, for example, the law of gravity, that law remains the same whether I'm in New York or whether I'm in New Delhi, whether I'm studying that law in the morning or whether I'm studying that law in the night. That law remains the same. So the value of gravitational constant may change depending on which place I am in, but the law itself remains the same. Whereas in spirituality, that is not true. Although in spirituality also there are some objective means of making spiritual progress, for example, meditation. But meditation itself is such a diverse thing, and meditation itself has so much variation, which can also vary from person to person, that one cannot really have a very objective view of meditation like the way we have an objective view of scientific laws. So even if two people are following the same guru, or two people are following the same set of rules taken from Patanjali Yoga or any other authentic source, but the way they are practicing it may be very, very different. So although theoretically one could say that science is about the relative world, which is Maya, and spirituality is about the absolute world, which is Brahman or God, but from the practical point of view, actually the opposite is true. That science is about objective laws which do not change with space and time, but spirituality is about subjective relationships which change from person to person, and as the person moves, they change even more. So, this is something very, very crucial for us to remember. So, now when we ask the question, is there anything scientific about spirituality? We need to be a little more specific, because science in general is a very, very broad thing. Science is so vast that it itself encompasses a wide variety of thought processes. So the way a physicist thinks about a problem is actually very different from the way a biologist would think about a problem. And this I can say from my personal experience, because I have done research in both physics and biology, that the way you would approach a problem in physics is very different from the way you approach a problem in biology. One example of that is, in physics, there are some very well defined laws which remain the same with space, time, and age. But in biology, there is so much of variation. Every cell has a different behavior, every organism has a different behavior, that one cannot really think of physical laws like we do in physics in the case of biology. And so is the case with mathematics or chemistry, or with or for example engineering, that the way people think in each of these domains is actually very, very different. So when we ask the question, is there anything scientific about spirituality, we also need to be a little more specific, that what kind of science are we talking about? Are we talking about physics, are we talking about biology, or are we talking about something else? Similarly, there is another very important, two schools of thought in science, which is known as the world of theory and the world of experimentation. So we need to ask this question again, that does a theoretician think in the same way as an experimentalist? So a theory or a theoretician is a person who basically uses some kind of mathematical tools to carry out analysis of some physical laws or physical phenomena. And an experimentalist is the guy who actually demonstrates whether that theory works or not. It is very easy to come up with equations which may be very fancy and very, very complicated. But what really matters is, whether those experiments, whether those theories really work or not. And that one can demonstrate only through the process of experimentation. And again, I can say from personal experience that the way a theoretician approaches a problem is actually very different from the way an experimentalist approaches a problem. And here again, when we talk of the question, is there anything scientific about spirituality? We need to be very clear. Are we talking about it from a theoretical point of view, or are we talking about it from an experimental point of view? And which aspect of science does spirituality comes closest to? So this is the most important point of this presentation, which is that spirituality is close to experimental science. And this is something that I would like all of you to remember, that spirituality is not about giving some fancy theories of Atman Brahman, or the world inside or the world outside or the world of Maya. Spirituality is about practicing those ideals in our day-to-day lives and demonstrating that they work, exactly same as what happens in experimental science. Experimentalists do not really care about theories. They are not bothered about fancy equations. They are not bothered about some complicated algebra. What experimentalists care about is demonstrating whether those ideas of science work or not. Similarly, in spirituality, one may read the Gita, Upanishads, Vedas, or the Bible or the Quran, but just reading them doesn't really matter. What really matters is whether you can demonstrate whether those theories work in your day to day life or not. So, this is the closest that spirituality comes to experimental science. Now, in science also, we all know about Peter Higgs. He got the Nobel Prize last year for his discovery of the for the Higgs boson. But my dear friends, this Higgs boson was actually predicted by Peter Higgs in the 1960s, almost 50 years ago. But he won the Nobel Prize only last year because the Higgs boson, which he predicted theoretically, was actually discovered experimentally only about 2 years back in the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. So in science also, the highest award or the highest prize or the highest recognition is actually given for theories that actually have been demonstrated in experiments. And exactly that is the case in spirituality also. So spirituality is not about reading the Gita and the Upanishads. Spirituality is actually about practicing these ideas in our daily lives and convincingly demonstrating their efficacy. And this is where the spiritual path is very, very close to the scientific path if we talk about experimental science. But there is one subtle difference between the two, and the difference is that in experimental science, the demonstration of the efficacy is to the world outside. But in spirituality, the demonstration is to our own selves. If a person is making spiritual progress, there is no way to go and prove this to the world outside. One has to prove this to his own self, and this is for one's own personal benefit. There is another, although there is a similarity, as we just discussed, between spirituality and experimental science, but there is also a very, very important difference that we need to remember. And the difference is that science is about the measurable, whereas spirituality is about the immeasurable. This is something that we need to remember very, very clearly. That we should not try to measure our spiritual progress by using the tools of science. For example, if you want to measure the weight of a substance, you should not use a clock. Clock is used for showing time. Similarly, science has developed some tools which are very, very useful for studying various kinds of physical phenomena, but spiritual progress cannot be measured in that way. For example, nowadays, many people talk about this thing called gross national happiness instead of gross national product. But that, in some sense, will decrease our happiness, because we are trying to measure something which is inherently immeasurable. So, this is an important difference that we all need to remember. So science is what gives us a house, but spirituality is what makes it a home, because it's only when people who are living in a house actually have real feelings for each other, real love for each other, does a house become a home. But this does not mean that spirituality is more important than science, because you cannot have a home without a house. And you cannot, but if you just have a house which is not a home, even then it is meaningless. So both science and spirituality have their own place in society, and we must respect each other for its own benefits. And similarly, science gives us utility, whereas spirituality gives value. This is a very, very important point that we must remember. We also need utility. Utility is something very, very useful, but we must not stop there. When we have things, when we have people, we derive utility from them, but we also must also add value to those relationships by treating them in a respectful manner. Now, another very important difference that comes in the context of science and spirituality is this thing between doubt and devotion. As the famous scientist Richard Feynman once said, religion is a culture of faith and science is a culture of doubt. And this is very, very true. That in science progresses only by having more and more doubt. Scientists all over the world are constantly trying to find some limitations or flaws in existing theories and always trying to make improvements. In fact, in the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, when scientists could not find anything new, which would actually show that there was a flaw in existing theories, they were actually quite disappointed. They were actually looking for some results which showed that existing theories are incorrect so that they could make progress. But religion or spirituality is something different. There is definitely a place for doubt in spirituality also, in religion also, but after a certain stage, faith is very, very important. One cannot make spiritual progress just based on doubt. Doubt is necessary, important in the initial stages, but later on it must convert to faith. But here the scientific aspect comes because devotion is not blind faith. So there is something about devotion which is actually scientific and which helps us in differentiating between blind faith. And this is very important for all of us to understand. If we really want to develop, if we really want to progress spiritually, we must develop devotion, real devotion, but not fall in the trap of blind faith. And how do we differentiate between the two? So the idea is that a person with true devotion will never make self contradictory or false statements in order to prove the value of his or her devotion. Now, this is a very, very scientific attitude that a true devotee has. So, what is science? If we talk about it from a very, very broad perspective, science is about coming up with a self consistent and logical description of various physical phenomena around us. That is essentially what science is. We may go into details of physics, chemistry, biology, but essentially science is about coming up with a self-consistent and logical view of the world around us and then to try to make sense of it. So devotion shares this property with science, that a person who has true devotion will also make self-consistent statements in order to show the value of his devotion. If a person is making self contradictory statements or false statements to prove how great his devotion is, you can immediately say that person is trapped in blind faith. That person does not have true devotion. And this is something very, very important for us to understand, that devotion is actually very, very scientific in its attitude. Although devotion talks about faith and science talks about doubt, but this idea of being self consistent gives a very, very scientific flavor to the idea of true devotion. As the Catholic priest Thomas Merton once beautifully said, we stumble and fall constantly, even when we are most enlightened. But when we are in true spiritual darkness, we do not even know that we have fallen. My friends, this is another very, very important thing that we need to remember. So, as we have discussed, there are two very important scientific aspects of spirituality. The first one is that spirituality is like experimental science. Experimental science does not really care about theories. What it cares about is a clear demonstration of those laws in our day to day lives and showing that they work perfectly. And secondly, the quality of devotion or the quality of faith also has a scientific character, in that devotion leads to a self consistent set of ideas that make you more devoted. Whereas if you have blind faith, then you will end up making self contradictory statements which will be very, very different from what science does. So, this brings us to the end of our presentation. I would like to end with a very nice quote by Carl Sagan, which is, Science is not only compatible with spirituality, it is a profound source of spirituality. When we recognize our place in an immensity of light and in the passage of ages, when we grasp the intricate, when we grasp the intricacy, beauty, and subtlety of life, then that soaring feeling, that sense of elation and humility combined, is surely spiritual. So are our emotions in the presence of great art or music or literature or acts of exemplary selfless courage, such as those of Mohandas Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. The notion that science and spirituality are somehow mutually exclusive does a disservice to both. I would like to thank all of you once again for your patient listening. If there are any questions, I'll be very happy to answer. Thank you. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. I will unmute it. Yes, Miss Rita. Miss Rita? Miss Rita, are you there? Anybody else would like to ask a question? Yes, Mr. Narayan. Hello, Narayan ji. Hello, Vibhaji.
Yes, hi. Namaste,
Namaste.
Kushalji.
Somehow I am unmuting people who are raising their hands, but their mic is not turning on.
Yeah, maybe they have the problem on that side. They can even, you can ask them to write the question on the chat box.
Okay, okay, okay. So there seems to be some problem with some audios of some
Yeah,
people.
their software is not allowing to talk. They may not have a mic or they are not,
Okay, okay,
using.
okay, okay. So if anybody would like to ask any question, you may even write in the box below.
Box. There is a chat box also at the corner down there. So they
Right,
can write there also.
right.
You mean?
Hello.
Hello.
हाँ जी बोलिए संदीप जी.
So, thank you for the talk. We have two questions, one from Anupama, my wife, who's also listening,
Okay,
and one from me.
okay,
Anupama's question is maybe you'd like to define spirituality and differentiate it from religion,
mm-hmm.
because that's obviously something that people, and including uh, Anupama and I talk about. So that is the first question. What do you mean? How would you define spirituality, and how is it different from religion?
Okay, okay, okay. So
You want to take one by one, or should I tell you the second part? I mean, maybe we'll just do one by one.
okay, okay, okay. We'll do one by one. Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank Sandeep ji and his wife Anupama ji for this beautiful question. That this difference between spirituality and religion is something that is very very important to understand. So as I just said in the beginning, that that science is about things that belong to the outside world, outside of our eye, and spirituality is about things that belong to the inside world, inside of our eye. So all the things that we feel belong to this domain of I, me, myself, all the things to which we are attached to. When we start analyzing them very carefully, when we start thinking about the relationships that we have with them, and when we make efforts to make those relationships very, very healthy, without going into the ideas of moksha or enlightenment or, some samadhi, but at a very, very practical level, that when we try to make those relationships much more fruitful, much more healthy, and much more win-win for both of them, not trying to draw some unwanted advantage from the other person, then we have begun going in the spiritual domain. Now, how is this different from religion? Because religion also has a similar aim. Of course, religion has led to a lot of problems in this world, but there are also many good people who have been using religion in a very, very nice way to become very good human beings. So, in that sense, spirituality and religion share a lot of common ground. But the primary difference is that spirituality is something very, very personal. That when I am thinking or when I'm analyzing my relationship with things that I believe belong to the domain of I am doing it as an individual. But religion begins when we start doing it as a group. When my notions of good and bad are dictated not just by my own thinking, by my own understanding, but by what others in my group believe to be the right thing. That is when religion begins. So, religion, in some sense, is merely a statistical property that when a group consists of a certain number of people and when they have common notions of right and wrong, that that group becomes religious. Even a group of atheists, in that sense, can be very religious because the moment a group of atheists they start forming ideas which are rigid, which all the group members have to adhere to, they have started practicing religion in that sense. But spirituality is something very, very personal, very, very individual. It depends on your own notion of right and wrong, which you have to analyze yourself. So does that answer your question, Sandeep?
Yes, thank you very much. It really does. And I think that was the understanding I had too.
Thank
That
you.
spirituality is very personal and religious is also a little bit more expressive. I thought it was a little bit more scientific because it really deals with the outside world.
Right, right, right.
And, but yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Sandeep, you had a second question, right?
Yes. So I think and this is in spirit of more of a discussion, and I saw on your website you are a believer of Socratic method.
Right, right.
So let's spend some time, maybe talking about a couple of areas that you raised. One was you differentiated between experimental and theoretical science and said that spirituality is more akin to experimental.
Right.
And the second is your point about devotion. So I would like to maybe raise a couple of clarifying thoughts and hear your reaction to it. One, for you to experiment anything in spirituality, whatever is your personal practice, if you believe in a personal practice of selfless action or whatever it is that you want to believe in as your spiritual path, I think it has got to start with a theory. It's got to start with a theory of saying, if I act in this way, it is going to result in X, which is a better state that I am in today. Right. If I don't do that X.
Right.
So that means for you to treat it as an experimental field, you've got to start with a theory. And personally, I think spirituality actually, if you think about it enough, it offers you a theoretical basis on how to live your life. So it actually starts with a theory. And of course, for you to get benefit from it, you've got to experiment with it. But I was not really sure why you would say that it doesn't have it's not similar to theoretical science. In some sense, it's very similar to theoretical science, and most of us may not have the ultimate outcome of it in an experimental form in terms of whatever the ultimate salvation or that ultimate enlightenment is. But at least we have a theory on which we are progressing towards that, and then we can start doing smaller experiments and seeing if it produces results.
Okay, okay. Once again, I would like to thank Sandeep ji for another very, very interesting question. So his main point, as I understand, is that even to do experiments, one needs to start with some kind of theory. You need some kind of assumption or hypothesis or some basic ideas on which to start doing your experiments. And in that sense, he says that, that spirituality also is close to theoretical science. So there I would like to clarify that, it is true that experimentalist also starts doing his experiments using some theory, but the way experimentalist uses theory is very different from the way a theoretician thinks about theory. Because when a theoretician is thinking about a theory, he or she is thinking about a very general framework which will be agreeable to all, which solves a problem in a very, very general setting. But when an experimentalist thinks about a theory, he is not trying to convince everybody using his theory. If you read experimental papers of science, most of the ideas that experimentalists have about theory are actually very, very practical oriented. They do not go so much into the nitty gritties of theory. For example, when say experimentalist takes a class on classical mechanics, and when a theoretician takes a class on classical mechanics, the class turns out to be very, very different. Or for example, in spirituality, for example, when say for example a person who is following Gyan Marg conducts a lecture, and the way a person who is following Bhakti Marg takes a lecture, the flavor is very, very different. And the difference is that although a bhakta also has some theory in his mind, but that is not in the sense that a jnani has a theory in his or her mind. So yes, it is true that experimentalists also need to have some theory to begin with, but that doesn't make them a theoretician, because an experimentalist also has a theory only to the extent that it helps him or her to carry out those experimental works. Similarly, to make spiritual progress, one doesn't really have to become a theoretician of spirituality. For example, some of the most enlightened, souls, they are not really, very good, speakers when it comes to, explaining, say, spirituality to others. So in that sense, I was making this differentiation that spirituality is more closer to experimental science, because a spiritual, a person who is serious about making spiritual progress, he or she need not, have a, very nice theoretical framework which others can also appreciate. So does that answer your question, Sandeep ji?
Yes, yes, no, I completely agree. I think the level of focus on theory versus getting benefit from that practice would vary, but it's a mix. I think that makes sense on how you're differentiating. That makes perfect. I don't want to monopolize, but if some other questions are there, please take them. Otherwise, I'm obviously happy to. We
Okay.
can spend some more time together.
Okay. So there are a few more people who have raised their hands. I'll try to unmute them, and if there are not, then I'll get back to you.
Sure.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Manmohan, kindly go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can hear you. Please ask.
Okay. This, for everyone to be able to experiment for oneself, they have to have a certain, at least fundamental knowledge of what they are doing, and that they acquire from the outside world, either from other speakers or others who they think are more advanced in that path.
Okay.
Now, you said world is full of people who don't even know that they are on the wrong path, for example,
right.
Who are in darkness.
Right.
They will profess their knowledge
okay.
with full faith, but it's not correct, like your example you gave, because they are not enlightened in that way. So how does one, when somebody is trying to truly gain some valid information, what sources they depend on, and what do they depend on as a outside sign of validation that they are depending on the correct information even to get started in to begin with? And do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes,
You
right.
have to start someplace, and nobody is born with this knowledge.
Yes, yes,
So to acquire that, you have to be on the right path.
yes.
And how do you determine that validation?
So once again, I would like to thank Mr. Manmohan for this very nice question. It has great relevance from the practical point of view that in for example in science, if you want to learn algebra, or say if you want to learn calculus, or if you want to learn physics, there are some standard textbooks available which you can read. And every textbook, after every chapter, it has a set of exercise problems and some examples. And if a person does all those exercise problems and works out all those examples, then it is very likely that you would have gained a very good understanding of those problems, of those concepts, and then you can start applying it to other areas and get correct answers. But in spirituality, it is very, very different. And the main difference, as I mentioned earlier, is that science is about things which can be measured, and spirituality is about things which cannot be measured. So that is what makes spirituality so much more complex and so much more difficult to progress. That, as Mr. Manmohan just asked, that every person who is trying to make spiritual progress is faced with this fundamental question, that when I'm reading a book, when I'm listening to a person who I think is spiritually advanced, how do I actually decide whether I'm making the right decision or not? And that unfortunately is very, very complicated. And equally unfortunately, there is no single guidebook that one can follow. But the nice thing is that our ancient sages have written certain books that more or less we can be convinced that they show us the right path. For example, the Gita and the Upanishads, they contain a lot of ideas which many people over the ages have subscribed to, and they have gained from that. But again, there is a problem, because even the Gita or the Upanishads can have multiple interpretations. For example, we have Shankaracharya, Madhavacharya, Ramanujacharya, who have actually given three very, very different interpretations for the same book, and all three of them strongly say that the other two are wrong and my theory is correct. Now a person is in a limbo, that which whom to follow. Should I follow Shankaracharya? Should I follow Ramanujacharya? Should I follow Madhavacharya? Or should I follow a totally different thing? Or should I write my own commentary? Or should I have a totally new idea? Now that is something that one cannot have an answer like we have in science. So spirituality, again, as I said in an answer to Mr. Sandeep's question, that spirituality is a very, very personal journey. There is no single, straightforward answer to this question, that, how do I decide what is right or wrong? It is all up to what priorities I have in life. Now, one way that one can, think about it is that no matter which interpretation I follow, no matter which ideas I believe are right and wrong, what effect does it have on things that I care about? So if I have my list of priorities right, suppose in my opinion my family comes first, then say my job comes second, then say my hobbies come third, then say fourth something else comes fourth, then something else comes five. Now how does that decision that I've taken, that this particular spiritual guru is right, how does that decision impact my list of priorities? If it has a positive effect on things which are high in my priority, then I can be pretty much sure that I am on the right path. If it has a negative impact on things which are high in my priority list, then I should think twice before following that guru or before following that particular advice. So that is perhaps the only thing that one can subscribe to. Otherwise, pretty much it's a very, very personal thing, and one has to learn the art of decision making. There is no single rule book for this.
Thank you. That is very, very useful explanation. And I think That's true. Ultimately, whether it benefits you or not is dependent on what your opinion of what happened. I think that's very true. And if you think you're a better man for that,
Yes.
there is no other things needed in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you
Appreciate
very
it.
much, Mr. Manmohan. Thank you.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can. Please go ahead. Please ask a question.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, this entire question of spirituality and science being two different fields and supposedly not in accordance with each other started with the debate of evolution versus creation. What comments do you have on that? How do you synthesize those two together?
So this is a very interesting question. I would like to thank Mr. Joshi for this. That this idea of evolution versus creation. So I was actually having a discussion on this with my colleagues at Weizmann Institute in Israel about a few years back. That all this modern science talks about creation, talks about evolution, but our scriptures say that even our Hindu scriptures they say that the world was created with four people who came from Brahma, and every other religion has such stories of creation. So what they said is that it's very much possible that the world was created in 4000 BC, and what the God did is that he placed everything, all the fossils, in such a way that human beings will later be fooled in believing that it has all evolved into into something. So how exactly this world began is very hard to say. Whether there is actually a God who created this, or whether it has been evolving randomly, is a very, very hard question. But what we know for sure is that evolution is a reality of life. Evolution is a fact of life. Even if we forget about what happened before 4000 years or before 10,000 BC, even in the last 2000 years, for which we have very good records, for which we have very good history, we do see that species evolve, that the human features which were there 2000 years back are actually very different from the human features that are there today. Even a lot of species of fish, for example, have evolved a lot over these years. And why to talk of years? There also have been experiments where, for example, some types of fishes have evolved new features even in a period of months. So evolution is definitely something real, something that we experience in our day-to-day lives. So that cannot be denied, no matter what. Now, what happened 5,000 years back, what happened 10,000 years back, that will always be a matter for speculation, because, as I said earlier, that in science also, what finally matters is whether you can experimentally demonstrate the theory or not. And no matter what theory we have for what happened before 10,000 years back, there is absolutely no way of proving whether that theory is correct or not. So how did this world began will always be a matter for theory, but in reality, in today's life, as we see evolution all the time, day in and day out. So that is something that cannot be denied. As for creation, we do not see it in our day-to-day lives. In the past 2000 years, for example, there is no convincing record that God is actually trying to create something. So that is something that is again will be a theory, but evolution is something that we observe on a day-to-day basis. So that is something that we cannot deny at all.
See, the problem is you're trying to prove God by scientific methods, which cannot be done. You
Exactly.
understand what I'm saying?
We can neither prove God nor can we disprove God. So
Yeah, exactly. And so that is where the debate, I think, should end, that we should agree to disagree and to some extent not try
yes,
to synthesize unnecessarily too many things into one.
yes. That is very true. I totally agree with that. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Joshi. Namaskar, Swamiji.
Oh, yes, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, Swamiji. Can you hear me?
Uh, yeah, yeah. Actually, I wrote the words also. I just have a pointed question.
Yes,
Can you say something about the place of faith
yes,
in
Swamiji.
science and technology,
Yes.
place of faith?
Yeah, so that is, I would like to thank Swamiji for this very, very interesting question that, we all know about the place of faith in spirituality or in religion that, unless we have faith, one cannot make, a great progress. But what about the place of faith in science? Does science have any place for faith or not? So the answer is again yes. That without faith, it is actually very difficult to make scientific progress. A very simple example of faith is that for example, I personally am a theoretician. So when I do theory, when I'm writing an equation, say when I write x squared plus y square equal to z square. Now that equation may look very simple, but from a layman's point of view. But actually, if we start thinking about any mathematical equation from a real mathematical perspective, there is actually a long history to it. Even a simple thing like 1 plus 1 equal to 2. From a purely mathematical point of view, that is very very hard to prove. So even to show that 1 plus 1 equal to 2, people have written pages and pages of theorems and lemmas to show that that is true. So when a person does theory, in today's world, there is a lot of history, there is a lot of work that has gone into showing that those equations are right. For example, calculus. When Newton invented calculus, there was a lot of heated debates that used to happen with people around him who were into mathematics, because there are certain aspects of, say, Newton's theorem, of Newton's calculus ideas, which are actually quite questionable if you take if you talk about it from a very rigorous mathematical point of view. But today, when we use calculus, we do not think about it twice. We do not think about all those mathematical, complications and difficulties which are there at the, foundations of these various mathematical ideas. So that is where, faith sort of comes into science also. That when we do science, when we, do experiments or when we do theory, we do not actually go back and check every single thing that has been done for the past 300 years or 400 years or 5,000 years. That is practically not possible at all. There are certain things which we have to take on faith that they are right, but again there is a method to check, without going into all those theoretical details. One could just do some simple experiments, some simple computer simulations to see that those equations more or less give us results which we expect. But there again, there is of course an element of faith that we believe that the equation that we are dealing with and its foundations more or less make sense. So that is where faith definitely comes in science also.
Oh yes, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I appreciate your explaining it so clearly.
Thank you, Swamiji. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Is there any other question? Mr. Joshi has a question. Vibhaji, so shall we close?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we can. Thank you very much, Kushalji. We really enjoyed
Thank you,
each and
Vibhaji.
every, yeah, even question answers and even the first talk also was really very, it was like what, it gave us very clear picture of many things.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Vibhaji. I would also like to thank all the attendees for their patience, all the people who asked their questions, and especially to Swami Chidananda ji who took time out of his busy schedule to attend this presentation. Thank you so much once again. Hope to see you again in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.